Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be doing a very random speculative video about Starfield performance, or like CPU performance, because, yeah, I've been paying attention to the Starfield release, mostly I've been paying attention to like the various performance benchmarks that have been coming out for the game, because like a game that I'm kind of considering maybe playing. Um, I normally play indie FPS games that nobody's ever heard of, but this looks not boring, so who knows? Maybe I'll pick up Starfield, but I haven't yet, and I also don't do gaming benchmarks. Also, I don't have a 4090, so even if I had so even if I already picked up Starfield, I wouldn't be able to do gaming like CPU scaling benchmarks because I like my fastest GPU is a 4070 Ti. It lives in my daily system, and I'm not moving it out of there. And then my next fastest GPU is like a 2080 or a 1080 Ti, depending on what benchmark you run on them. So, anyway, but yeah, I've been paying attention to the various performance numbers coming out for this game, and I stumbled across this article from PC Games Hardware where they did a bunch of CPU testing, and I was looking at this chart that they have, and I was really wondering, like, what does this game scale with? Because this chart, like, if you look at it, doesn't really make a ton of sense, right? So, if we look at the 13th gen CPUs, why is the 13900K like 9% faster than a 13700K? Why is it like 18% faster than a 13600K? Because if you look at the frequency, right, they're at different frequencies. So that's like the lazy assumption is like, well, if the CPU is clocked higher, it gives more FPS. Yeah, but it's not clocked that much higher. Like according to this chart, that 13900K is at 5.5 gigahertz, which is only 3.7% higher than the 13700K, right? They both use the same core architecture. It is physically impossible for a 13900K to do more than 3.7% more work than a 13700K. Okay? If you have 4% more clock cycles, you can do 4% more work. You can't do 10% more work. So where's that 10%, 10-ish percent FPS increase coming from? Or 9% FPS increase coming from, considering that there's only like a 4% clock speed difference? Well, obviously the 13900K has a lot more cores, but then why is like, I don't know, like the 7600 faster than or wait, no, that's not, well, I mean, the 7600 is awfully close to a 12700K, which is weird if this loves cores, because this is like a 12-core CPU and this is a 6. And then we have the 7700X, which is just straight up ahead of the 12700K and basically the same as a 12900K, right? Like these are, what, 1% apart, right? Like, okay, that doesn't really seem to be a core count thing. And then we have the 7950X behind the 7800X 3D. Then, like, the 7950X 3D is even slower than that because, like, it can't boost as high than as the 7950X. Also, probably the scheduling on that thing is broken because asymmetrical CPUs were a very good idea that totally should have happened. It's like multi-GPU setups. Like, yeah, developers will totally support your weird hardware configurations. Definitely. That's a thing that happens. Especially game developers love weird hardware configurations, which is why SLI is dead. Anyway, and then we also have things like, 5800. Well, okay, these seem to be, well, okay, no, 3700X getting crushed by the 5600. Though the funny thing about the 3700X is the cores on the 3700X are so slow that, like, in overall multi-threaded performance, the 5600 is basically a 3700X. So that actually kind of makes sense. I guess the 13400F has more cores than the 7600 and it's losing to the 7, but it's clocked so low, so that kind of makes sense. But yeah, like 5800X 3D way ahead of the 5900X, right? So that's like, this doesn't really seem to be about cores. And the X3D chips do seem to be consistently doing better than the highest core count CPU of their family, so it seems to be something related to memory things. And if we look at the 13th gen chips, like the 13900K and the 13600K, and we say, okay, so cores probably aren't what's affecting the performance here. the other difference between like a 13900K and the 13700K, as well as the 13600K, other than the clock speed and the core counts, is the amount of L3 cache on these CPUs. The 13700K has 30 megabytes of L3, the 13900K has 36 megabytes of L3. That could easily explain that 10% difference, right? Because that's like 36 megabytes of L3 is 20% more than 30 megabytes of L3. And because like you don't get linear performance increases by adding more L3 cache. If you did, the 7800X3D would be 3 times faster than a 7700X. It isn't. So yeah, it would make sense that, 20% more cache could deliver 9% more FPS. That's like, okay, that seems like a sensible result for that kind of difference between the chips. And then like the 13600K has even less L3 cache. And yeah, there's also the disparity in the total amount of L2 cache, but the L2 cache is actually per core, or per like core cluster for the E cores. So yeah, this isn't like you can have one thread use all of the L3 cache. You can't have one thread use all of the L2 cache. So the L2 cache isn't really like that. That's not actually as big a difference as it looks like on paper because it's core specific. Anyway, so the 13th gen chips are probably like some of it's going to probably be the core clock, some of it's going to be the cache. And that's how you get a 13700K, or I mean a 13900K being, 9% faster than a 13700K. Right? That seems like a sensible explanation to me. You have 4% more clock speed, 20% more cache, you get 9% more FPS. Reasonable explanation. At least to me. But what's a really interesting comparison on this chart is the 13700K versus the 12900K, because these two chips are extremely similar. And yet the performance difference between them is absolutely massive, right? The 13700K is 28% faster in this chart. And 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 we'll go over the specs between them, because that's how I did it the first time I recorded this video. So 13700K, 16 cores total, 8 P cores, 8 E cores. 13900K, 16 cores total, 8 P cores, 8 E cores. So same core count. In terms of cache, we've got 30 megabytes of L3 versus 30 megabytes of L3. That's exactly the same. We've got a lot less L2 cache on the 12900K than on the 13700K, but well, that could be the difference, but we'll get to why I think the difference actually exists soon enough. Also, why all the Ryzen CPUs are doing so badly. Especially like the 7000 series Ryzen CPUs are doing so badly. Anyway, so okay, so very similar CPUs except for the L2 cache. But in this chart, there's one major difference between these two chips. The 12900K is running DDR5 4400, and the 13700K is running DDR5 5600. And again, the difference in performance between these two chips is 28%. DDR5 5600 is 27.27% faster than DDR5 4400. So it is mighty suspicious, in my opinion, that the CPU using 27% faster memory with the same core count, same L3 cache, and just a different L2 cache configuration is, roughly 27% faster. Right? Like it has 27% faster memory, it delivers 28% more FPS. Starfield looking at this chart, it really looks like Starfield might have the performance scaling of the IDA bandwidth benchmark. Because, it is just I think it's way too much of a coincidence that the chip with 27% more memory speed is also 28% faster. That one extra percent might be from the L2 cache. It might be from the extra frequency, right? The 13700K is actually just clocked slightly higher than a 12900K. According to this chart, it's 8%, actually. Yeah, so most of it could be the memory speed, and then a little bit of it would be the CPU frequency. And we already have a reason to believe that this game seems to be relatively memory sensitive, because otherwise the 13900K and 13700K should perform the same. But the 13900K does have more L3 cache, and L3 cache does sort of compensate for some amount of memory bandwidth, right? So, yeah, this game seems to just love memory bandwidth, which would also explain why the Ryzen 7000 chips are doing so badly, because, well, their memory system sucks. That's the nicest way to put it. The Infinity Fabric on a Ryzen 7000 chip has a maximum read speed that, as far as I know, and I don't even know if Computer Base is running the Infinity Fabric here at like 2000 megahertz, or I don't know what the auto speed is. I think it's 1800. But ultimately, I don't know. It could be 2000. I have no idea. I can't read German. I'm not gonna investigate. And yes, I do know, well, yeah, I'm not gonna investigate too much. But even then, let's say it was at 2000. The Infinity Fabric maxes out at 64 gigabytes per second, as far as I know. On a Ryzen 7000 chip with 1 CCD. And whereas DDR5 5600, assuming that you had like the theoretical bandwidth of DDR5 5600 is 89 gigabytes per second. It literally doesn't fit into the memory bandwidth of a Ryzen 7000 Infinity Fabric, like, at all. So if this game has a large amount of data that it constantly needs to read and write, then that would explain why the 7800X3D is a bit better than the 7700X, right? There's like a, 12% difference. But it's not massively better, because this data set is so big that it doesn't fit in the L3 cache of the 7800X3D. And because this data set is so big, you need a lot of memory bandwidth to read and write it constantly, which would explain why the 13700K absolutely demolishes the 12900K. And also why having more L3 cache still helps, because there's going to be some stuff that you can conveniently cache. This isn't a video encoding benchmark, right? A video encoding, why does the 7800X3D suck at video encoding? Well, because when you're encoding video, videos are huge. The video lives in the memory, it gets pulled into the CPU, encoded, and put back in the memory. Your L3 cache for video encoding is basically useless. The other scenario where a 7800X3D sucks is something like Cinebench, which is the exact opposite of video encoding, because it's a workload that fits entirely into the L3 cache. Right? Cinebench doesn't care about memory bandwidth, it doesn't really care about memory timings, the only thing it cares about is CPU frequency. So the 7800X3D is bad at Cinebench because it's clocked lower than all the other Ryzen 7000s, and it has more cache than Cinebench can really use, right? Or it has more cache than Cinebench needs. And so that would explain why we're seeing sort of these performance numbers here, is Ryzen generally is just not very efficient with memory. AMD's memory controller is also just generally less efficient than Intel's, because for DDR5, for example, as far as I can tell, AMD doesn't use per bank refresh at all, which is supposed to be a pretty big performance uplift to DDR5 over DDR4, is that you don't have to refresh an entire rank of memory every time you want to refresh the memory. AMD doesn't do that. And by JEDEC spec, something like 10% of your memory clock cycles is used up on refreshes. So, that theoretical bandwidth number that I have here, yeah, you don't have most of that at JEDEC timings. Actually, no, you have most of it, but a lot of it is missing. And depending on your workload, you can have a lot less of it. If your workload is very random, it'll actually get very slow. Yeah, because, but anyway, so yeah, it really looks like Starfield is sort of has the performance behavior of the IDA bandwidth test, which is interesting. It also makes me wonder, what if you ran Intel with DDR5 7600, which is a pretty convenient speed that you can get up to with Intel CPUs. If your motherboard is good and your CPU's memory controller isn't trash. Fun fact, I recently discovered that my 13900K is so bad that literally enabling a DDR5 7200 XMP on the Apex doesn't post. Because the Apex, like the auto rules on the Apex, do not expect any CPU to be as bad as my 13900K is. I just find that hilarious. Like that, it literally doesn't post at 7200. Because the auto rules like assume that the CPU should work at voltages that are way too low for it. Also, I've never gotten 7200 stable on that CPU, so I actually don't know what voltages would make it work, but yeah, that CPU's trash. But if you don't have a completely trash CPU and you have a good motherboard, 7600 is very, very, very doable. More than that gets very annoying very fast. Anyway, but at 7600, you would have like 35% more memory bandwidth than what what PC games hardware is testing with. So, you know, assuming this game keeps scaling, like it seems to scale linearly with memory speed based on the 12900K versus the 13700K. Actually, I wonder if we have any other examples of that. I mean, we have DDR4 2933. Actually, yeah, you wouldn't really expect a 10900K to lose to a 3700X ever. Like, you know, like these are CPUs I know. A 10900K is a better CPU than a 3700X. Actually, wait, let's do this, because 3200. Oh. Oh boy. So the 10900K is 9%, like the 3700X is 9% faster than the 10900K. The 10900K's memory, like the 3700X is using memory that's clocked 9% higher than the 10900K. Yeah, this really seems to be scaling like the IDA bandwidth benchmark. That's hilarious. I never thought I'd see a game that does that. That is ridiculous. Like Ryzen, like I cannot overstate the Ryzen 3000 series cores are bad. Like really bad. Like huge upgrade over Ryzen 2000, but that's because like AMD didn't reach instructions per clock parity until Ryzen 5000. So a 10900K has like no business whatsoever being slower than a 3700X. Unless, of course, its memory is clocked 9% slower, in which case, yeah, it would be 9% slower. Because this is basically the IDA bandwidth test, which is just, man. Well, that's a convenient piece of evidence to support, well, yeah, evidence to support my theory here. Anyway, yeah, so I guess if this keeps scaling the way it seems to, obviously at some point you're going to have more memory bandwidth than you have actual processing power. At the end of the day, the data has to go somewhere, and it's going somewhere for a reason, right? Like the data goes to the cores do something with it, and then they put it back in the memory. So at some point, you're going to have more memory bandwidth than you have like gigabytes per second of processing power, right? But I don't know where that point is, and like 13900Ks have a lot of processing power. Like a lot of processing power. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting. So like theoretically, you know, a 13900K running 7600 instead of 5600 might be able to deliver 149 FPS instead of 110. And then if you also took out the refresh, because the stock refresh is supposed to be 10-ish%, you can pull it down to like 0.5%. But even 1% refresh is a huge, huge performance uplift. Or well, it's like a pretty significant performance uplift. But let's just round that down to like another 8%. Like you could maybe hit 160 FPS, assuming that it doesn't hit like a CPU processing speed limit, right? At which point, maybe raising the CPU frequency might actually do something. Well, yeah. Anyway, so this was just something I noticed with this benchmark from PC Games Hardware, which is that like this game really seems to just scale with memory bandwidth more than actually another example 2600X versus 9900K. Like I think there might be some people who would be willing to debate me about whether a 3700X is better than a 10900K, but I think we can all agree that the 9900K is not slower than a 2600X. Like unless it's bandwidth bottlenecked, right? Which at 2666 it very well might be. So yeah, this really seems to have the like performance scaling behavior of the IDA bandwidth test, which I can't believe I've ever seen. Like, like that's insane. I don't think I've ever seen a game that behaves like that. Um, I wonder if this is because the consoles use GDDR. Because like theoretically, they should have heaps of memory bandwidth compared to your typical DDR-based systems. Wait. I don't pay enough attention to consoles. Does the Xbox only use GDDR, or is it some weird mishmash? I can't remember. I don't really care. But anyway, yeah, like, obviously needs more testing that I'm not going to do because I don't benchmark games. I don't have a 4090, so I don't know how I do. Well, I guess I could use like FSR to run the game at like 480p or something. With a 1080 Ti or a 2080. to force a CPU bottleneck no matter what. Just run it at like 240p or something, and then see how it scales with memory bandwidth. But I'm not gonna do that. Also, I don't really feel like buying the game. But yeah, I think this is definitely something worth testing. Is to see like, does it just keep scaling with memory speed? Because it sure looks like it might. Because, yeah, it seems to love memory bandwidth more than anything, which is potentially very bad news for Ryzen 7000. Also, I was hoping to end the video at this point, but another point. Yeah, that is, like, if this actually loves memory bandwidth more than anything, then Ryzen 7000 is probably kind of screwed because of the Infinity Fabric. Like, it has a hard limit on how much data it can transfer. And that limit, like, if you have a really good 7000 series chip, you can run FCLK at 2200. At 2200 FCLK, you're going to get 70 gigabytes per second. Max. You can't do more than 70 gigabytes per second on a single CCD CPU. The Infinity Fabric literally just doesn't do more than that. So yeah, if this game scales up to like, I don't know, say 80 gigabytes per second or 100 gigabytes per second, maybe more than that. Like DDR5 7600 is, what is it? 128 divided by 8. 121 gigabytes per second. Theoretical max throughput. Again. Not, like, you're never going to see this number in real world applications. Because most real-world applications are a little bit too unpredictable for the memory controller to queue up all of your read requests that nicely. But, well, who knows? Maybe Starfield is actually, maybe Starfield's memory access is very, very linear, and it does actually manage to hit almost peak memory bandwidth. But I really doubt it. Well. Yeah, I really doubt that would be the case. That would be so weird for a game, because games tend to be kind of unpredictable in terms of what you're doing, you know. But anyway, where was I going with this? But yeah, let's say it scales to some like insane amount of memory bandwidth. Well, your FCLK, like your Ryzen 7000 chips, are kind of bottlenecked to like 70 gigabytes per second max. Now, it could also be that the game loves memory bandwidth, but it doesn't actually need that much peak bandwidth, right? Because, like, you have workloads that still scale massively with memory bandwidth, but they don't, they're not, like, their memory access isn't so perfectly optimized that they hit, like, the theoretical bandwidth limit. Oops, I just hit the mic. Sorry about that. But and for those, it might be interesting if 2-to-1 mode on Ryzen 7000 helps. Because 2-to-1 mode, especially once you go past like 7600, you don't actually have much of a latency penalty for it. Actually, but if you hit DDR5 8000, you don't have a latency penalty, like basically at all, compared to 1-to-1 on Ryzen 7000. And at that point, you have way more like peak memory bandwidth. Not that you can use it, because again, the Infinity Fabric can't do that level of memory bandwidth, but depending on how the memory controller buffers the data, you might actually still see performance benefits, even on like a single CCD CPU with like DDR5 8000, maybe. So that would be an interesting test, is to see if like Starfield is that like one application that benefits. Like, well, no, there are synthetic benchmarks that scale with like a scale to with 2-to-1 mode really well on Ryzen 7000. But yeah, it would be interesting if we had like Starfield as like another workload that scales with 2-to-1 mode, because most things like at 7600, you kind of, it's basically a tie compared to 6200. But yeah, like a tie is not a win. So it would be kind of like, it could be an interesting test to see if like 7600 is faster. And also, I like if it, like the funny thing is, this is a game. So the dual CCD CPUs, because for pure compute workloads on a dual CCD CPU, you benefit a lot from the 2-to-1 mode, because you have the two Infinity Fabric links, so you have that combined memory, like the read bandwidth, and like the bandwidth gets combined for the two CCDs. So you can actually like move a lot of data on a dual CCD CPU. But the issue with a dual CCD chip is that if you're in a game, you probably need to keep your threads kind of, coordinated to some extent. So the Infinity Fabric might actually be, well, actually no, because the 7950X seems to be doing pretty okay here. But like, if you need to coordinate the threads, you might be wasting a lot of the Infinity Fabric bandwidth on just the CCDs talking to each other. Still might be better than the 7800X3D though, depending on how. Yeah, so this is an interesting workload, is what Starfield is. I wish there was a canned benchmark for this, because then I'd be willing to actually run it. But yeah. Anyway, so it really does seem to be just like a massive memory bandwidth hog. At least looking at this performance chart from PC Games Hardware, I imagine more people will be testing the game in the near future. Actually, I wonder if like 7950X, and let's say you killed the SMT. Actually, maybe you don't have to turn off the SMT. Well, actually, I'm not sure. Like, I have some weird optimization ideas for that CPU. Because like, I wonder, could you tune a 7950X into beating the 7800X3D? Because it does, like, it has a bandwidth advantage. And so if you could somehow force the game to actually like I don't, like, how much bandwidth does it need per thread? Does it even, like, is the Infinity Fabric actually a limit, or is it just the memory controller side bandwidth? Because again, like, yeah, your theoretical memory bandwidth is way higher than what the Infinity Fabric will ever do, but your real world, like, random access memory bandwidth is a fraction of your theoretical bandwidth. So even in workloads that are very bandwidth bottlenecked, like, if they're random enough, you can have a bandwidth bottleneck that doesn't get anywhere near the theoretical max bandwidth. Anyway, at this point, I'm just completely rambling. I mean, ultimately, this video is basically just rambling in the first place, but I did say it's speculative at the start of the video. If you were expecting any concrete, useful information, well, you came to the wrong place. But hopefully you found this at least somewhat interesting, if not particularly useful. And yeah, that's it. So thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store. And I've also got a Bandcamp. There's links to all of that down in the description. It would be much appreciated if you check them out. That's it for the video, so thank you for watching, and goodbye.